Okay, I want to take a moment to talk a little bit about what happened. Recently, the Canadian Parliament cheered on a 98-year-old Ukrainian veteran of World War II. Now, if he's a Ukrainian veteran of World War II, which team do you think he fought for? I'll give you a hint. It was not the Allies. He fought for the other team, yes, the Germans. The Germans had a lot of units which were called SS, Schutzstaffel units. They did various jobs, not just in the camp, but they were sometimes shock troops. Anyway, there were many of them in Germany and outside of Germany in aligned nations and nations that the Germans took over and recruited from within. Some of these men were volunteers, others were volunteered. But the point is, nobody in Canada stopped to think about the history behind this. They knew where this guy was, they knew how old he was, they knew where he lived, they had records of him immigrating, having a family, a job, everything else, paying taxes. They knew enough to get him into Parliament. They put him up there and they disregarded what should have been obviously bad optics. I don't know if they have no knowledge of history or if they just disregarded it, but regardless, that's where they stand. And now everyone's doing cheetah flips to try to act like, oh, well, I can't believe this and that, to condemn the guy, maybe send him to jail, who knows. Let's slow it down here. Number one, not everybody who was part of one of those SS units volunteered for those units. Number two, we don't know what this guy did or didn't do. He was probably in his early 20s, not an officer, not in any position of command, not even a non-commissioned officer. And there are many other guys who served in those units who did not commit any war crimes just because they wore those uniforms. Believe it or not, that's the fact. But the witch hunt's already started, so who's going to be next? We can't hide who is being backed in Ukraine in the meantime by the West. So there's a lot of inconsistency in this extremism narrative. Let's talk about things one by one. First of all, you can look this yourself. Oh, Canadians, everything about this guy. If I looked just 4 or 5 days ago, there'd be stories about this guy and standing ovation, but now it's all about Canada honoring a Nazi, honoring Nazi. And I'm using this word on Google here because, look, the Global News, Guardian, all these other news services are using it, and they're not getting deplatformed. I'm not making any money off this video. I just have to talk about facts as they are. But you can research this yourself. This poor bastard probably wanted nothing to do with this, and he was dragged up there. Ukraine is like the new mask, so everybody goes up there, and yes, it'd be a good thing. Come on, Grandpa, let's just do this, stand up, get a standing ovation. So he did that, and then it blew up in his face, and now they're trying to blame this guy instead of themselves. This is the unit he was most likely part of, the 14th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, 1st Galatian. And interesting thing about this, it was in Ukraine, and it was allowed to exist after Ukraine, not as a unit, but the people and the ones who supported it, they were not necessarily all thrown into camps, not because the Russians were being sympathetic, but they eventually became more or less loyal, or at least they didn't make any trouble for the occupiers, and they were pretty thorough and did what they were instructed to do from everything I found out about them, and they stayed that way until the de-Russification, and then they went back into positions of power, and the rest is history. We know about Azov and everything else reforming. I don't know if statues of Bandera were allowed to stand during the period of Soviet occupation. I couldn't find anything on that, but that would be interesting. There were a lot of monuments and memorials, mostly likely constructed after the Soviets left. But anyway, this is the unit he was, in all likelihood, part of it. Certainly not the only foreign SS unit. There were others. The one I mentioned earlier, I knew somebody who was part of this unit. He died recently. He was 96 years old. He was not volunteered. He did not volunteer into it. He was volunteered. He was an Estonian. He started in the Estonian military. After World War II kicked off, he was forced to fight for the Germans. He was a air crew, ground crew person who worked on airfields. He described times when he got bombed by the Allies. He didn't know if they were British or Americans, but he was out there doing his job as an air crew, ground crew person. And after the assassination attempt on Hitler, that's when things changed. He said he was reorganized. His unit was reorganized, and they were sent to different places. He was put into an SS unit, and he was no longer fixing aircrafts. He was on the front lines in Russia, or on the Russian front. He was injured, lost a finger, eventually made his way during the retreat back onto a train, and while he and his squad was on a train headed back to Berlin to defend Berlin, because by that time the Allies had already broke through and they were racing to the city, and what was left of the German forces and non-German aligned forces were constructed to go help defend it. He took one look at the lieutenant who was on the train with him, and the lieutenant said to the squad, he said, all right, guys, I don't know about you, but I'm not into this. I say we make a bail for it. And they all jumped off the train, and they hid out in the bushes until they saw some Brit troops walk by. They came out, surrendered to the Brits. It was not pleasant. Some of them got beat up. A couple guys with gold fillings had their faces punched in, and the British took out the gold teeth. They were given very little to eat, but it was better than being captured by the Russians. I mean, the whole reason that the Estonians were inclined towards cooperating with the Germans was in part because they had such a bad history with the Russians. You can read about that later. But anyway, if he were alive today, he could probably be facing the same situation that poor guy up in Canada is facing. 98 years old, and now what? You're being called this and that, and you did this and that. And I think the only reason we're allowed to do this kind of thing is because it's been so long, there's so few veterans left that there's really nobody to speak for him. You couldn't do this 20 years after the war because there were enough of them saying, hey, no, that's not right. That didn't happen this way. So most of these guys are gone. The few that are left are going to be crucified, and the ones that are dead, they're also going to be pilloried. And who am I talking about? Well, here's one example. Major Larry Thorne. American guy, right? Yeah, MACV SOG. This is Vietnam. Military Assistance Command Vietnam Special Operations Group. He was early in Vietnam. In the 50s he started. And he was killed in 1965. His body his remains were found not too long ago. I want to say maybe 15, 20 years ago. And he's buried at Arlington. But there's one small thing about Larry Thorne. He actually was in an SS unit. He was Finnish. He served in the Finnish military. And when the Finns cooperated with the Germans because they had a real problem with the Russians on their border, the Germans offered training. So this guy went to a training session with the Germans, and he was put into an SS uniform. Now, he was not going through a selection or elite or volunteered for this. This was the unit he was assigned to. So the Finnish troops who fought and trained with the Germans were trained as SS. And they did not guard camps. They did not do any war crimes. But he very much, for the rest of his career, regretted posing for that photo. But what are we going to do next? Are we going to take his grave out of Arlington National Cemetery? Because he fought nobly for the Americans in Vietnam. But, I guess that doesn't mean anything these days. Oh, yeah, he also got an Iron Cross. He was probably one of the only guys, I think the only guy buried in Arlington who ever got that. So it is awkward. I'll grant you that. But does he deserve to be exhumed? Well, I don't know. If we're going to do that, we might as well talk to the Chinese because, this guy, Taiwanese general, well, yeah, he trained with the Nazis too. But I'll let you research that on your own. I want to focus on the Ukraine aspect here. Now, while we're going crazy about Ukraine and this Canadian who served for the Nazis, let's not forget, they're still over there now. Here's a current picture.
The battalion was formed in 2014 during the Russian annexation
SS insignia, these are Azov guys or wannabe Azov guys
of Crimea.
Currently in there.
It began life as a volunteer force, which then...
We have to get this from Al Jazeera because there is no regular American news. I'm surprised they even allowed this on YouTube. But again, you can see these newsreels over here. It's no secret. They're there, although they are trying to downplay this. There's even some Americans, like Boneface, who's been over there. Kent McClellan. Now, he's been accused of not having been over there, but the more I listen to him, and he's had a couple of interviews, this guy has the receipts. He can prove it. And if they have a problem with him, I'd like to see a face-to-face interview between whoever thinks he wasn't over there, getting paid by American government to say that, and himself. And if they can disprove it, fine. But this one recent podcast, this is actually better than the other one in my last video. This is better produced. He talks about a few things. And here he says where Azov actually confirmed that he was part of the unit.
And there obviously is some kind of fed op to just fucking credit me. And finally fucking Azov stepped in the picture, and that was awesome of them. But dude.
So Azov did step in the picture and say that you...
They did. Yeah, they did. And we have their email up on a fucking virtual server, you know what I mean? And they fucking actually put the virtual server up themselves too, just for the email purposes. So I thought that was really cool.
So Azov stepped in and said that you were fighting in Ukraine.
Absolutely. Yes, they did.
So, I mean, I don't know what more evidence or proof they need, but anyway, you can go back and forth on that all you want. The fact is there are guys like him. You want to discredit him? Oh, not him. There's many more guys just like him who've been over there. He didn't go over there because of Ukraine. He went over there, obviously, because of his worldview. And again, he talked about why not back him more.
His question was, do you support Biden, Boneface?
can someone play that clip real quick? He sends rockets to Ukraine. Yeah, that's a big deal. So, yeah, that's about it. On that topic, no, get fucking further involved, dude. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, I know he's old enough. He was there when they made the goddamn deal in 1996. Why aren't we still fucking backing them? You know? Like, motherfucker, like, you didn't have a problem bombing the fuck out of Bosnians, so why the fuck do you have a problem killing these goddamn Russians? Go get them, Joe. Quit being weird.
Quit being weird. Yeah, if only. He's talking about why they don't get more involved and send Americans and more weapons or whatever else. And, you know, this is where it gets sticky. Here you have exactly what you want. You got a guy who's fighting the Russians. And if he were only Ukrainian and Azov and stayed over there and didn't come back here, I guess that wouldn't be as much of a problem. They also asked him about Zelensky, which is interesting because people say, oh, you know, there can't be Nazis over there because Zelensky's Jewish. Well, I don't know if he doesn't like Zelensky because of that or just doesn't like him generally, but he's got an opinion.
Well, you say you don't like Zelensky. Yeah, keep it, you know how they are on YouTube.
Well, yeah. I mean, here's my thing, man. I mean, like, dude, you can fight for your country. You can fight for your community without fighting for a president. And in fact, like, I think it's almost important just for the simple sake of morality of the human people who are fighting for Ukraine to draw that line that divides the government from them. You know what I mean? Like, pretty much it's our job to be like, man, fuck those guys. We're here really for these people because they matter, because they're the racially conscious ones. They're the nationalistic ones. They're the ones who fucking, you know, working class. And it's them who have shrapnel and bombs going up in their house. And that's the problem. Is fighting for them, not fighting for government. Fighting for government equates to fighting for a paycheck.
He's absolutely right. And of course, more and more it seems like the military is fighting for a paycheck. But it's always been true that you don't fight for democracy. You don't fight for communism or leftism or socialism or whatever. You don't fight for isms. You fight for the guy next to you. You fight for your buddy. So he's actually got a point there. And he didn't go over there because he believes in any kind of Ukraine cause. And I don't think the American government or Biden cares if you do or you don't. Right now, they're ignoring the same law that prohibits you from fighting as a mercenary in any other country. They're ignoring it if you go over there and you fight as a Ukrainian mercenary for Azov or not. And if you're willing to do that, that's fine. Now, if you went for the other team and fought for the Russians, I'm sure they'd have a problem with that. And he's talked enough about this where I'm pretty certain he's at least spent some time over there. And of course, there's a paid op from Bellingcat, which is paid for by American and UK money. U.S. neo-Nazi says he fought Ukraine, records place him in Florida. Well, no, the records don't place him in Florida. This is an arrest record from April. He came back in March and admitted that, yeah, he was arrested in April, but they have not been able to show that he didn't do that, but they're paid to do this. He actually used to like Bellingcat because they provided some intel information, but again, he's inconvenient. They don't want this word up there in the way of their global initiative. Bellingcat, funded by U.S. and UK intelligence contractors that aided extremists in Syria, including the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a splinter group of the CIA. It takes money and puts out talking points and other initiatives, and of course it calls itself the National Endowment for Democracy. How bad could that be, right? Democracy. They're all over the world doing all kinds of stuff. You can watch the new Atlas. He talks a lot about them. I don't need to go into depth on that, but the Gray Zone isn't a bad source. And as I mentioned earlier, during the Khrushchev's reign, after Stalin died, when Khrushchev took over the Khrushchev thaw, that's when Azov was able to sort of come out of the closet again and start not really being as open, but not being beaten down. They weren't worried about being thrown into jail. And ever since then, they've sort of been a factor. The Bandera worshipping, the beliefs, the unity that goes along with it. They've been a factor for years. They really got pumped up in 2014 with our intervention and helping them with their overthrow. And yeah, here they are, in formation, in uniform. And this is NBC saying, Ukrainian veterans of the Azov Battalion, formed by a white supremacist. This is where it gets confusing. Everybody over there, whether you're in Ukraine or Russia, looks kind of like these guys. Almost all of them, not all of them, but most of them are quote-unquote white guys. So this whole idea of white supremacists, this is ridiculous. They're not white supremacists, they're Ukrainian supremacists. Germany, Nazis, they were not white supremacists, they were German supremacists. This is an American identity that has been thrown upon you, white people out there, to make you think that you're like each other and you should stick together as a unit and they can target you better. The minute you do that, you're automatically a racist. And that's not what these guys are doing. These guys are Ukrainians and they are against Russians, and both of them happen to be white, but that's not their ethnicity. So anyway, this formed by a white supremacist is misleading. That's an Americanization thrown in there. Banned from receiving U.S. aid. Well, that is a lie because they're part of the Ukrainian military and they're definitely getting aid. I'm sure Boneface could talk more about that, and he thinks there's not enough going over there, as do all of them. Meanwhile, Israel lobby group ADL rehabilitates Hitler's accomplices in Ukraine. What they mean is that this is Stefan Bandera here. This is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And the ADL has been doing backflips trying to say how these guys are the good Nazis. And they're not really that bad, and they're working for us, and they're not working against Jews. And Bandera's out of the picture, and Zelensky and everything else. It's really just an awkward situation to be in, to have to explain this kind of thing. You can see this again. They issued a statement declaring that the Azov battalion is no longer far right. I don't know what they did to no longer be far right, but this symbol right here, I don't think he's wearing that. I think somebody put that on him. But this black sun in the back, that symbol has been in use and still is. The wolf's angle, this one here, is still in use. But again, if you are this guy, the mass shooter down there in New Zealand, and you use that, well then wait a second, now you are a bad guy. Now you are a supremacist. So not a supremacist, supremacist. Not a supremacist, supremacist. I don't know. If this guy got on a plane and went to Azov and shot Russians, maybe he would no longer be a supremacist. I'm confused. I don't know what to think. But you can decipher this yourself. Yeah, if you're the wrong person, they slap that on you, you figure it out. But we still stand by the solidarity of Ukraine, okay, regardless. So, meanwhile, back home, we're looking for more stats to pad the narrative. We have an election coming up, and even without that, we have shifted away from, blaming Islamic extremists because, that's not politically correct. And there hasn't been a major one, well, not too many more attacks since 9/11. And we want to try to, get away from blaming people that might actually, we need their votes. So let's try to, number one, get Americans who happen to be white thinking as a group. Number two, get them playing and feeling on their guilt. And then number three, use that against them. And that's been the plan here. The trouble is there isn't enough domestic white American extremism going on to satisfy the demand. And they've investigated this to some extent. It's still being padded. It's still the rule of the day. You still got to go out there and find more of this. It says Merrick Garland and the rest of the FBI. And this is the mission. It's not going to change, especially, like I said, not with an election coming up. But the demand greatly exceeds the supply. So that's why they love a guy like Boneface. They'd love if he stayed in America and committed crimes, they could hold him up. But the problem is he gets over there in Ukraine and does what they want him to do in Ukraine. It's awkward. So what do you do? Well, one thing you have to do is if there's any kind of a crime that happens where it doesn't fit the template, you get your Community Relations Service, America's peacemaker for communities facing conflict based on actual or perceived race. If an incident happens and the races don't line up the way that the template calls for, the political template calls for a certain set of circumstances, if it doesn't go the way they want it to, they send these guys out there, they hand the victim's family a script, they say, could you please read this on the news? We want to encourage people not to use race as a factor. We want to calm everybody down, make sure they go out there and just read this. It'll make things go over smoothly. And for the most part, they do. And here's an example. This person's talking about America's peacemaker, and this guy here was a retired police chief who was hit by a couple of youths driving a stolen car in Arizona. He was riding a bicycle, hit from behind. 64 years old, and he's dead. And of course, his daughter gets out there and is reading off the script, which sounds the same for just about every other situation. Don't believe race or his profession played a role, et cetera, et cetera. They put this out there to stick to the narrative. The narrative is, these kinds of things happen. It's not based on race. But when the races go the other way, then you can be sure it's all about race. And the community relations people do not show up and ask the family to not say things. Or they do not tell certain groups not to go and protest and picket and smash windows. But anyway, you can see all the different directions this is going. At home, we need more domestic extremism to satisfy the political narrative, and it has to be done by certain people. but abroad, we actually support groups who do the same thing, provided they're shooting the right people. I don't know. And in the meantime, we've got to put a 98-year-old guy who probably didn't want to go in front of the Canadian Parliament up for sacrifice. So the whole thing, it's full of bozos. Stay tuned. It's only going to get better.